The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. To meet today's dynamic and complex national security challenges, the Obama administration has tried to reorient strategic thinking from an emphasis on U.S. military power to a more comprehensive integration of civilian and military, government and non-governmental resources and capabilities. Supporters say this has improved our ability to anticipate, manage, and resolve threats and conflicts. Critics contend this whole-of-government approach often results in the overcommitment of resources, ambiguous mission objectives, and the undermining of the military's primary purpose of defending the national interests. With nearly a 50-year career in the Department of Defense, our guest today has been at the forefront of this policy evolution. Linton Wells directs the Center for Technology and National Security Policy at National Defense University. His previous DoD positions include posts as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary and Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. He also served 26 years as a naval officer. He's been awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service 3 times. Linton Wells, welcome to International Focus.
Good to be here, Doug. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start, if we could, sort of frame the context for all of this with a quote by former Secretary Clinton. If we could take a look at that. One of our goals coming into the administration was to begin to make the case that defense, diplomacy, and development were not separate entities, but part of an integrated whole, and that whole of government had then to be enlisted in their pursuit. So this 3D approach, as it's known, could you give us a little bit of historical context? Why at that point in our history and not 50 years earlier or not at all?
Well, I'm not sure why it wasn't 50 years earlier, but I think at this point in our history, coming out of the lessons learned from Iraq, is the Defense Department at least learned that it's not enough just to focus on the fighting the wars piece. You have to be able to do post-war stabilization and reconstruction as well. And in 2005, this actually was assigned a mission priority comparable to that of major combat operations for defense. In addition, people said, well, what about if you never get to wars in the first place? How can you continue what DoD would call phase 0, so-called stable peace, indefinitely? And so in 2007, the maritime strategy laid out that preventing wars is important as winning it. So what you have in the span of relatively few years in defense is a tectonic shift in thinking. This is mirrored then in State Department and AID, and if you're looking at this phase 0, how you avoid getting to war in the first place, you have to develop the capacity of foreign nations, and that's not just their ability to fight wars, but building their institutions, rule of law, governance, and clearly there are disputes that have to be negotiated. Defense Department can do some, Agency for International Development, AID, can do others, State Department can do others. So it's defense and development and diplomacy together.
We'll talk a little bit about that sort of phased model, if you would. If we have phase 0 as sort of an addition, what were the other phases before that?
Well, so defense divides conflict up into 6 phases. Phase 0 is basically peace, stability, and the desired state you'd like to be in. Phase 1 is the immediately pre-crisis, dissuade, deter, saber rattle, whatever. Phases 2 and 3 are the combat phases, either offensive or defensive, depending on the situation. Phase 4 is post-war stabilization. Phase 5 is return to civilian rule and reconstruction. So that phase 0 to phase 5 are the 6 phases. And so in 2003-4, when the way Defense Department spent its resources was investigated, it was found we were spending like 95% of our resources on phases 2 and 3. And that's why the Secretary issued a priority shift guidance to say you will put more emphasis on this post-war stabilization and reconstruction. And then over time, that's evolved to now, let's avoid getting into the conflict to begin with.
So some people have said this basically means the militarization of some of these other phases, like diplomacy. And how does that play out in, well, let's take, for example, one of the sort of centerpieces where this first was applied, and that's AFRICOM, the U.S. presence in Djibouti. Now, that really was, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first places where this doctrine was really to be applied from the outset, right? I mean, wasn't AFRICOM sort of envisioned as the embodiment of this model?
So yes, but let me go back to a different point. But your earlier point that said some sort of critics say that this both militarizes the non-defense roles and dilutes the defense role. And I don't think there's a clear answer to that. There are cases where certainly people feel that the Israeli army, prior to the fighting in southern Lebanon a few years ago, had lost its combat edge because it was spending more and more time in pacification type things. If you look at so-called combined arms, which is to say the combination of armor and artillery and maneuver and close air support and this sort of thing, the kind of fighting we've been doing for the past several years in Iraq and Afghanistan has not called for a lot of these combined arms capabilities. And so some units are certainly less well trained than they might be. So I think it's a dynamic process. And you say, this is the situation we're in now, these are the skills we need, we have to let others have reduced importance while we're doing this. In some future conflict, it might be a different balance. So I think you can make the argument, and all the adjustment will occur as the world situation occurs.
And so talk a little bit about the origins of AFRICOM and sort of what was envisioned.
So this is not a core specialty of mine, but let me just observing. The sense in Africa was that AFRICOM used to be, the countries in Africa used to be under Europe, the European Command, in Stuttgart, Germany, which was also the supreme headquarters for Allied Commander operations in NATO. Actually, I'm sorry, it's the same person. The NATO headquarters is in Brussels. And people came to think that as the future importance of Africa was going to grow, because the economies were going to grow or because other countries were establishing presences there or whatever, the U.S. needed to pay more attention to Africa. And so whether the European Command, which I think at that point had over 90 countries, could pay enough attention to Africa, and this was the origin, I believe of Africa. So it's split off now, and I believe there are 53 or so countries under AFRICOM Command. The question then is, what is the mission? Is it a full combat commander like the Pacific Command or European Command? Is it to focus on this sort of building partner nation capacity, humanitarian assistance, the 3 Ds? And certainly there was an idea at the beginning it would be more the latter. This would be a combatant command more like Southern Command, where you're dealing with a series of interactions, military to military, but not active combat. That said, shortly after the command was stood up, you had the Libyan operation, which came under the purview of Africa Command. And I think it just goes to show how unpredictable and complex the world is, that even something that you would think that dichotomous would not have been really predicted in the stand-up of the organization. The last piece here is, what do the countries on the continent want? I mean, one of the things you have in NATO is this partnership with, going back to the end of World War II, where a strong U.S. combat presence was desired. And that's clearly not the case in Africa. And I was at a meeting a couple of years ago now, in conjunction with the stand-up of AFRICOM, with a group of African ambassadors and people like that. And their point was, you need to listen to us. And if you're going to come in and say, we want you to join the war on terror, The greatest terrorist on the continent is malaria, it's malnutrition, it's AIDS. Those are the things that are killing our people, not Al-Qaeda. And if you're worried about, if you want us to sign up against the Chinese threat in Africa, these are people who are bringing jobs, they're bringing investments, whatever. So you need to sit down and look at this through our lens, not just through yours. So I think this is an evolving process where AFRICOM's going to go. And as I say, we've clearly had a combat phase, we've had a non-combat phase, but then you have going after the Lord's Resistance Army, for example. Going after Somalia, I think, is actually turning into a pretty good success story. So what's the right balance?
Well, what about that? And that touches on, if you look at the sort of traditional method, or mission rather, of the military, of sort of dealing with threat, if you tie the other two of the 3Ds, development and diplomacy, to that mission, does it suggest that the sort of humanitarian concerns might take a back seat if, in fact, there's no credible military threat? In other words, will the resources follow the perception of where the potential military threat is and give short shrift to places that might not have that kind of threat but have just horrendous humanitarian needs?
So I think there are a number of complicated issues here. One is, and I've had a number of discussions with organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, who has expressed very severe concerns that even though the military may do humanitarian operations effectively, the fact that they're doing them at all is perceived by the non-governmental community as putting them at risk, their people at risk, because they are no longer seen as being neutral, but aligned somehow with military activities. The pure fact, resources have to be considered. I mean, the base Defense Department budget this year is something like $526 billion in the proposal for FY14, fiscal year 14. On top of that is another $88 billion in what they call overseas contingency operations, OCO. So you're dealing with something like $614 billion of resources. I haven't looked at this year's budget, but the combination of state and AID is typically the order of $40 billion. And so you're dealing with a 15-to-1 mismatch in resources. So it's not surprising that defense can do a lot of things well, or at least quickly, and that will cause tensions. But it also was, I think, what was driving Secretary Clinton to say we've got to find a way to integrate these better. Otherwise, you really have this massive defense stovepipe, which will lead to militarization of other things, unless you find a way to integrate it.
Well, we're going to take a short break. When I come back, I'd like to talk a little bit about how this looks on the ground and where it's in practice. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Linton Wells about holistic national security. So we talked about this 3D approach, defense, diplomacy, and development. So how does that look on the ground? I mean, we know what a military operation on the ground might look like. We know what sort of the traditional development, well-digging kinds of things might look like. I think we have a sense of what diplomacy might look like. But when we try to combine the three in some sort of unified effort, what does that look like?
Well, so the first thing to understand on the ground is that the ambassador is the president's representative in the country. And the country team, which the ambassador sets up, which includes all aspects of the embassy, including AID and the military, is the basic organizing principle in any given. And so one of the things that has to be considered is, whereas we have these regional combatant commanders who look cross-cuttingly on an operational basis at a whole region, Within the State Department, you have regional bureaus back in Washington, but on the ground, the organization is largely country by country by country. So how do you integrate those different just structures to begin with? Second is there's been a shift in the thinking about how you develop the capacity of partner nations. And it used to be there were large aid projects to build dams and wells and railroads and airports and things like that. One of the legitimate questions that come out of not only Afghanistan and Iraq, but also out of the achievement of the UN's Millennium Development Goals, or lack thereof, is the top-down approach really the best way to work? And what's the right balance between having a coordinated strategy at the top versus allowing for bottom-up energy, enthusiasm, and you greatly typically reduce the wastage that happens when you start at the top of the funnel to see how much actually gets to the people if you work from the bottom up. And so I think that's a sort of doctrinal, philosophical issue that's working its way through the system now. And one very interesting aspect of this in AFRICOM is reflected in something that they call the Adaptive Logistics Network. Okay? So typically what happens when, it's not just AID, it's World Bank or anyone comes in to, let's say you want to ship goods from Mombasa all the way up to Juba. So Mombasa in Kenya up to Juba in South Sudan. And so people come in and they hire trucks. And they typically hire trucks at approximately Western shipping rates, which completely distorts the local marketplace. So now all the local shippers who want to ship things are competing for the Western rates on the trucks. So what the AFRICOM Command is trying to do with Adaptive Logistics Network is find a way to develop the African capacity to do shipping and things like that within their own resources, within their own way of doing business, so you can hire that and build that capacity rather than coming in and distorting the market.
Well, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges coordinating the various arms of U.S. government, but one of the essential aspects of this, as I understand it, is you're bringing in non-government actors as well. So how is that coordination accomplished?
So this is a very hard thing for the military, in that we like unity of command. You like to have the commander, you'll have to clear-cut chain of command, and frankly, when you're engaged in the use of lethal force, you have to have the accountability that comes with that. The problem is that in almost any major situation today, we will never be doing this alone, U.S. military. And so the question is, how do you achieve unity of action when there is never going to be unity of command? Which means you're going to have to negotiate, you're going to have to communicate, you're going to have to collaborate in this. And so these are skill sets that are not often taught in our military. And frankly, on the other side, the NGOs typically are not terribly well resourced. They may be reluctant to work with the military for either policy or other concerns. They may not know how to interact with the bureaucracy. It's not easy to interact with the U.S. bureaucracy. And so I think this needs to be a greater area of emphasis in across the board, whether it's humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, whether it's building partner nation capacity, whether it's stability operations, or even here at home, defense support of civil authorities, you're dealing with state, local, tribal governments. That intersection is not always obvious to the National Guard or the Reserve.
So where's an example of really where this has been fully fledged and seems to be up and running and working rather well?
So I think there's a good example actually in the Philippines. And right after 9/11, in the southern Philippines, in the area around, the Muslim areas around Mindanao, the Abu Sayyaf was one of the most organized and dangerous terrorist organizations going. Through a combination of special forces, cooperation with the Philippine military, public outreach, that has largely been neutralized at this point. But there actually are two different insurgencies going on in the Philippines. One was the southern, largely Muslim. The other is the New People's Army in the kind of central Philippines. And the Philippine government has actually addressed that by using the Philippine Armed Forces to build the capacity of local villages and things like that. And in some cases, you've actually had rebels come down out of the hills and say, this is what we're looking for. But the key point, it was done by Filipinos for Filipinos. And you don't have this problem we have every time we intervene of, well, we have the watches, they have the time. How long are we going to be there, and we can just wait you out. As long as it's done by Filipinos for Filipinos, or by any national for any national, I think there's enormous strength in that.
And, all of this sort of conceptually seems to make a lot of sense, but as you've said, it really represents a pretty significant change in the culture of the military. What's been your experience with sort of the frontline boots on the ground as far as just embracing this idea?
So I think it depends a lot on the commander. And it depends a lot on the situation. There's a saying that says there's no development without security, and there's no security without development. And so there's this interlocking piece. And when the people in many of these countries get up in the morning, David Cullen has a very excellent book called The Accidental Terrorist. And he talks about how somebody might not want to be a Taliban, but the Taliban will pay him 5 times the government rate to go grow poppies instead of whatever it is the crop the governments are hawking for. And he looks around and says, I got to feed my family, whatever. Ideology doesn't bother me. I want it peaceful. I want some kind of rule of law, and I want to be able to take care of my family. So whichever group is going to do that best. And I think you've seen a real significant change in understanding in the U.S. military over the past 6-7 years since General Petraeus redid the field manual on counterinsurgency. So some units, for example, those in Al-Anbar during the Iraqi surge and everything, I think that got that pretty well. What kills us very often are the personnel rotations. You have somebody comes in and says, okay, I've got a year here. I've got to do something. And so he goes out and sits down with the village and the shura, whatever, and says, what do you need? In all sincerity. And the village says, I need a bridge, or I need a school, I need a mosque, or whatever. He says, right, got it. And so he puts the request in through the system, and sort of 13 months later, the money flows and the thing is built. But he's now gone. And so in the eyes of the locals, he hasn't kept his promise. And then you have other cases where people come in and say, well, whatever the other guy was doing has got to be bad, so I'll go change it, even though that might have been illogical. And so I think there are 2 major things we collectively need to do. Understand how to get more stability across the inevitable turnovers and these types of things. But I think the U.S. government collectively needs to pay more attention to information and communications and the underlying technology. I mean, the international term for IT, for information technology, is not IT, but ICT, information and communications technology, because radio, for example, is such an important piece. And yet, we as a government typically do not treat this as either an essential service or a critical infrastructure. It's left to the techies. It's left to the chief information officers. It's left to the communicator for the general. It's left to the wires and switches people. But these are issues that are changing winners and losers in economies, the ways nations interact, the way our children think. These are questions for ambassadors, commanders, and policymakers. And so I think one of the core pieces in any of these is the government as a whole needs to pay more attention to the information communications, the underlying infrastructure.
So going forward, then, what would be your recommendation to really truly implement this sort of 3D whole of government kind of thing? What could we do that we aren't? What are the low-hanging fruits?
So first thing we need to do is remember the lessons. One of the saddest memos I've ever read is a 1973 memo by Bob Comer, who was one of the major pacification advisors in Vietnam. And he wrote a letter called a memo called "The Bureaucracy Does Its Thing." And he talks about how the U.S. went in, and we had all kinds of really elegant and capable solutions, which were our solutions, not the Vietnamese solutions. And very often the technology was not appropriate to them. And so instead of listening and trying to figure out how to work together, we came in and tried to impose our answers. And honestly, you can line through Vietnam and that memo and right in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's chilling. So the first thing we got to do is figure, what have we learned, and how, because presumably we're not going to be doing this kind of a war again for a little while, so whenever 20 years down the pike, whatever we get to Ruritania, somebody can go back and say, okay, this is what we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. The second piece is, as we talked about yesterday, no lesson is ever really learned until behavior changes. So you can observe a lesson, you come back to your next year and re-observe the same lesson, you re-observe the same lesson. But unless you put together combinations of training and exercises and for the long-term education, you'll never get there.
Well, we'll have to leave it at there. Linton Wells, thank you for being with us. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,